Isn't that a great song? We don't need any other argument. All right, tonight we're going to get back into our study of 1 Samuel. And just as a reminder again, we broke this down into 3 sections. Everybody does, so this isn't unique with me. My only uniqueness is oftentimes the titles that I will give each one of these sections, that I try to grab from a verse that's in the section. And anyway, won't get into it that much. But Samuel, of course, first 8 chapters, Saul, 9 through 15. Now David, from chapter 16 to the end. And tonight, we're going to get back into chapter 16, verses 13 through 23. If you remember 2 weeks ago, Brother George taught last week, but 2 weeks ago, we talked about David being anointed and the fact that God, it said, I have provided me a king. And I think that's extremely important to see and understand the difference between Saul and David. And it just becomes even more and more clear as we go through the study of 1 Samuel. Our lesson tonight, the title of it is David, the Armourbearer. Now, that might sound a little strange, but it comes directly from verse 21, where after David came to Saul and stood before him, it says that Saul loved him greatly and he became his armor-bearer. Now, that's not really what he did per se, but that's what he made him. That means he gave him a position of prestige, a position that gave him access to Saul all the time. And of course, this gets a little more interesting as we get into the story of David, when David had to have been familiar with Saul's armor, and we'll see what happens when he tries to put it on. It doesn't work very well. When we looked at, again, going back into this previous, just to kind of get us a little bit more, if you remember back in the first part of this chapter, it says, and the Lord told Samuel, how long are you going to mourn for Saul? Seeing I have rejected him from reigning over Israel, fill thine horn with oil and go, and I will send thee to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided me a king among his sons. And we ended that lesson with verses 13 and 14, where, if you remember again, David was anointed, or I should say, he was anointed by Samuel in the midst of his brethren. Nothing is talked about as to why Samuel anointed David. I would suspect that he told David, but we don't know that. You don't know that. We have no idea. So he didn't tell his whole family. In fact, some people will say, well, the reason why, you'll read it tonight, the reason why Jesse sent a gift with David was to appease him in case he was mad because David had been anointed. Saul doesn't know he's been anointed. And like I said, I don't think anybody knows why. Samuel, in fact, if you remember, he anoints him, he goes home. He doesn't hang around. So when we look at this, again, then Samuel took the horn of oil, verse 13, and anointed him in the midst of his brethren, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. And then verse 14, but the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord troubled him. Now, both men have been anointed by Samuel at God's direction. So just as Samuel anointed Saul for his duties as king, David is now the new anointed one. David is now the one empowered by the Spirit to be king of Israel. Yet, we know that it's quite a while before David sits upon that throne. But here's the thing, if you'll pay attention to what you're reading and just stand back and watch, look, be an observer, you will see how blessed David is. Throughout his whole life, I mean, he was anointed. Well, he was blessed of the Lord. Saul, on the other hand, wasn't doing a very good job as it was when he was anointed and blessed of the Lord. But it's one of those things, and I may repeat myself a couple times on this. Saul, and we've talked about this as we taught through this, that Saul didn't pay a lot of attention to the leading of the Spirit. He didn't listen to Samuel's words when Samuel gave him instructions. And he didn't listen to him then, and he's not going to listen to him in the rest of this book. He must have resisted just about every leading of the Spirit because he made such foolish decisions. And now it's going to get even worse because he's lost or losing, I just say lost, the divine empowerment. So we're going to look, we picked this back up, we talked about it before, Saul's trouble. And so we're going to look at that again, but the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit troubled him. Now, Saul was already a troubled leader. But now he becomes a troubled man in a place of leadership. And that's a dangerous combination. Because now there's a vacuum of spiritual empowerment. There's a vacuum of spiritual leadership within him. This verse isn't about Saul losing his salvation. In fact, even the Jewish Targum writes about Saul, quote, losing the spirit of prophecy, losing the spirit of wisdom and prudence and civil government, and as a spirit of fortitude and courage, unquote. Now that's a Jewish commentary on the Old Testament. And they could see and understand. But he not only lost the Spirit of the Lord, if you notice this, it says, but an evil spirit, here it says, an evil spirit from the Lord troubled him. In other words, an evil spirit was allowed of the Lord to trouble him. His divine protection is now gone. And as if we were to bring it into the New Testament era, we would say now every fiery dart of the wicked will find its mark and spread its evil into Saul's life. Saul is now going to be in a supernatural spiritual battle, and he has no protection. With this restraint of the Spirit removed, Saul is going to be plagued. What are we talking about when we're talking about this spirit? We're talking about a spirit of anxiety. We're talking about a spirit of jealousy, a spirit of misery, a spirit of frenzy. These things were coming upon him. This wasn't just that he was, like you and I can get a little anxious, or we can become a little jealous, or we can fall into having a misery party, right? A pity party. Or even frenzy, meaning anger. So full of angst and being upset. Sometimes it happens, you know this full well. There are times when you can just get in a bad mood and you get angry at everybody. Well, no, you wouldn't be anything like that, right? I think we know, but we're not talking about the common feeling that you and I have experienced, but we're talking about an intense spiritual battle. Saul didn't want to heed the leading of the Spirit when he thought too much of himself. Now he has to battle a spirit that is dark and foreboding and attacks him. John Gill wrote on this verse that Saul, among other things, became, quote, fearful and alarmed by everything. He was full of envy, suspicion, rage, and despair. And all of these things you will see in Saul grow as this spirit continues. Let's continue on reading, because this is also something else that we'll see, that this is also the means by which David is going to be introduced into the king's court and become the king's armor-bearer. Verse 15, and Saul's servants said unto him, behold, now an evil spirit from God troubleth thee. You know, it's probably a wise choice of words in saying, instead of saying, Saul, you're going crazy. But they were accurate that a evil spirit from God is troubling you. His servants were bold enough to speak up. They could observe that this evil spirit affected Saul's behavior. Now, I want you to notice the incidents that are brought to our attention by the Spirit in this inspired account. Again, God withdrew his protection from Saul and allowed this evil spirit to trouble him. His servants notice Saul is disturbed, and they don't bring a complaint. They don't say, you know, you're just too hard to work with. You're crazy. What did they do? Look at verse 16. Let our Lord now command thy servants which are before thee, send us out to seek out a man who is a cunning player on a harp. And it shall come to pass, when the evil spirit from God is upon thee, that he shall play with his hand, and thou shalt be well. You know, I'm sure that a lot of you have probably heard at least a version of this famous quote. If you haven't heard the quote itself, at least a portion of it, where it talks about music soothes the savage beast. That was taken from a poem by William Congreve in 1697. That poem says, music has charms to soothe the savage breast, to soften rocks or bend a knotted oak. It is the idea, and of course his inspiration came from a Roman poet clear back in 16 and 20. So long before that even, most of us know that music is medicinal. I don't know how many of you have ever used the medicine that God gave you. If you haven't, shame on you. You need to understand that music makes a great deal of difference and can minister to you in a great way. In fact, I've always been jealous of people who can play a musical instrument, because I think that that musical instrument and being able to play it can also soothe you. I know singing does to me. I've told you before how there have been times where I've had a CD, or going way back to the cassette tapes, I've had that, and I've sat in here and played the music, not a soul in here, and sang the songs, and it ministered to me. I ministered to myself in that sense, but it was the music that did it. Music has long been used as a means to reduce stress, or to even help someone calm down when they're anxious. And so his servants applied this anecdote. Again, music ministers to us. It can soothe the aching heart. It can lift up the spirit that is bent low. It can put our mind back into a right frame of mind and praise and worship to the Lord. In fact, all of us should know full well the Psalms are songs. And they are songs with all sorts of applications. They are songs to be sung in times of distress, depression, anxiety, as well as joy, rejoicing, and worship. Music is important, and I could stop and go on for a great deal of time and explain a little bit more in detail how it is that the Lord even gives us that we are to sing unto the Lord a new song. How that we're supposed to lift up our voices in praise. Music is a gift from God. And so we're going to begin to look a little bit more and see what other incidents are noted in this particular story. So they've got this set up. They know that, look, let's listen and see if you send us out so we can find a cunning player on a harp, a stringed instrument. In fact, you do a little research, you'll find out that David actually created instruments. He came up with it. He was a skilled player. In verse 17, it says, and Saul said unto his servants, provide me now a man that can play well, and bring him to me. So this is where Saul's troubles also turn into David's blessing. So somebody else's trouble can turn into your blessing. Do you know that? That can happen. Then answered, verse 18, one of the servants and said, behold, I have seen a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite that is cunning in playing, and a mighty valiant man, and a man of war, and prudent in matters, and a comely person, and the Lord is with him. Now, one of the many servants that Saul had there was one of those involved in this situation of coming before Saul and saying, you know what? Here's a good antidote. You're getting this evil spirit come upon you. Let us go find this man. And so he says, we'll go get one. And what happens? One guy says, hey, I just so happen, right? That's again where this isn't all by chance. This is again, you can see the providential hand of God in all of this. And notice the characterization. I'm going to use it in a little different phrasing, but here's what he's saying. If we were to bring it up, this guy can play. I mean, we were talking about Johnny earlier. I remember Johnny Cozart. Maybe most of you don't know him. Few of you do, but that guy could play. He played a 12-string guitar, not just a regular guitar, but the 12-string, and man, could he play. This guy, we're talking about David, he can play. But when it talks about him being a valiant man, this guy is courageous. Well, I wonder how he knew that. Maybe the stories about being a shepherd, caring for the sheep, and maybe he told him about the lion and the bear. This guy can play. This guy is courageous, a mighty, valiant man, and a man of war. This guy can fight. He's got access to a sling, and I mean, you ought to see him. He's accurate with it. And he's prudent in matters. This guy is wise. He's got great understanding. David not only knew how to fight physically, he knew how to fight spiritually. David, it says, had great understanding. In other words, this is not some young, foolish, jesting young man. That's the way I was when I was a kid. I was a foolish jester when I was a little kid. I was not mature. David was not that way. He knows, in other words, he's saying how to carry himself. You're talking about inviting someone into the royal throne room around the king. He knows how to comport himself. He knows when to speak and he knows when to be silent. A comely person. This guy looks good. He doesn't have a big wart coming out of the top of his head. He doesn't have one ear bigger than the other. He's not a jester-looking kind of fellow. These things mattered when you're talking about being in the royal court. But most importantly, this guy is blessed. The Lord is with him. He is blessed, and this is the most important. It's listed as last, but it is the prime importance of all of these. You could tell this young man knows the Lord and knows his word. He writes songs. Listen, David wrote a lot of his songs while he was a shepherd. So this guy knew that David was gifted, and he knew he was blessed of the Lord. Everything that is said of David by this one servant was saying that I know a talented young man who is fit to be in the palace before the king, even though they didn't yet have a palace. I know just the man. What a coincidence, huh? Not. It was not a coincidence. Verse 19, wherefore Saul sent messengers unto Jesse and said, send me David thy son, which is with the sheep. Now, I don't believe that this is said in a condescending manner. Saul, though he is king, you have to remember that he himself kept his father's animals. And once he was sent on an errand to find some of the donkeys that had gotten lost. He's just simply stating a fact, and he's letting us know that David is the one that he wants, the one that's with the sheep, the one that this other fellow told me about. I don't want anybody mixing this up. I want this guy. Well, what was the response? Verse 20, and Jesse took an ass laden with bread and a bottle of wine and a kid, and sent them by David his son unto Saul. Now these were not provisions for his traveling to Saul. These were gifts. They were gifts to Saul. They may seem simple to you and I, but don't you remember when Saul was out looking for the animals that had been lost, and his servants said, hey, well, there's Samuel over here. Let's go see him. And what was Saul's concern? We don't have any bread. We don't have anything to take him. We don't have a gift to give him. That's what Jesse was doing when he was loading up that donkey to bring Saul the gifts. It was a sign of respect that Jesse was sending this offering to Saul. Verse 21, and David came to Saul and stood before him, and he loved him greatly. There was an immediate attraction. There was an immediate appreciation. And immediately, well, I don't know if it was immediate because this was written after the fact, but he became his armor bearer. Saul gave David immediate respect and appreciation. He gave him a respected position, which would put David in a place to learn how to conduct himself in a royal atmosphere and how to carry himself. Think about this. He had been out taking care of the sheep, and that was a needful place that God taught him the things that he needed to teach him to be the king of Israel, the shepherd of Israel. But now he's going to put him in a place where really he's going to learn a lot of times what not to do as king. But you know what? That's helpful too. You can learn, you know, when you don't have a good leader, you can learn how not to lead. There's a lot of things that you can prosper in. So Saul showed respect to Jesse by requesting a permanent position be made for David. Verse 22, so Saul sent to Jesse, saying, let David, I pray thee, stand before me, for he hath found favor in my sight. And it came to pass, the last of our verse, when the evil spirit from God was upon Saul, that David took an harp and played with his hand. And so Saul was refreshed and was well, and the evil spirit departed from him. Now, it wasn't permanent. We know that because David had oftentimes to do this. We know that as it gets into the story a little bit more, we're going to find out that in fact, not all the time did that evil spirit depart, because even though David was there and trying to help him out, at one point in time a spear gets chucked at his head. But David's music was so blessed by God that it refreshed Saul, and that evil spirit departed. In other words, it took his mind into a different place and caused the fits of fear, anxiety, or rage literally to go away. That's amazing when you think about it. Again, you may not have an evil spirit, but you can get depressed, you can be anxious, you can be despondent, and music can bless your heart a great deal. Now, some of the things that I'm going to just get into here a little bit is the idea of what we can learn both doctrinally and practically. And doctrinally, I think it's rather obvious, I've made mention of it enough times, that you and I should be able to see the importance of music in ministering to us and adding to us in our worship. How important is it for us to have music in our worship service? How important is it for us to have good quality music in our worship services? Doctrinally, we can also see that the Old Testament is here full of the teaching of God's sovereign grace and mercy. The one that his sovereign grace and mercy is poured out upon is blessed, but not because of anything in himself. Men naturally, first off, they looked, if you remember, when they came to Jesse and to his sons, they naturally saw the oldest. The oldest was the one who should have been in the rightful place of the firstborn to receive those promises. He may have been taller than all of his brothers. But God said, don't look on his countenance or on the height of his stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord seeth not as man seeth, for man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart. This man's heart was blessed with God's grace and mercy. It wasn't because David was always this way. It was because David was a born-again man who was receptive to the grace and mercy of God and walked in the light that God gave to him. David meditated on the Word of God. The more you will receive the light that God gives you, the more light you will receive from God. What happened with Saul? He rejected the light that God gave to him, and eventually the light was turned off. That's what happened to him. Doctrinally, we can see God's providential hand through this whole story in the affairs of men and even in the hearts of kings. We can see God working out his will in his way. Now listen, pay attention to this story. Do you see anybody being forced to do anything they don't want to do? Do you see anybody choosing to do something they don't want to do? No. It shows you again how that God works out his will in ways that we are unfamiliar with without ever violating what people say is the will of man. God never forced anybody, but he chose. Well, what about lessons practically? We need to see what one writer stated. Man plays upon the instrument, and the instrument plays upon man. Have you ever had a musical instrument that just spoke to you? There have been times when I have sat and listened to classical music, one of my favorites. I listen to a very broad spectrum. I like jazz. I won't tell you all the music I like, because some of you will laugh probably with some of it. But I do. I like a big variety of music. But I had an album. I've never been able to find it in a CD or anything since, but it was a group called the Guneri Quartet. And the reason why I liked it, they were playing basically chamber music, classical music. But it was a quartet. The reason why I knew about them is because our music appreciation teacher was teaching us to learn how to hear different instruments. Pick up this instrument. And so we had to learn about the viola, we had to learn about the cello, we had to learn about the bass, we had to learn about the violin. And he said, so I'm going to have you listen to this song, and I want you to tell me what instruments you can hear. Well, it was a quartet, you could tell. And so certainly it had to be a bass, a cello, a viola, and a violin. And he said, no. All four of them are played by the cello, or it may have been the viola, but it was all one instrument. But they all played it in such a different way that it sounded like four instruments. But I used to love to listen, and there's a lot of times that classical music that drove my wife nuts, right? But it would minister to me. I loved it. My plants even loved it. When you think about Israel, and Psalm 137 talks about how that Israel was taken captive, and how that it says they hung their harps on the willows. What are willows normally called? Weeping willows. Well, can't think of a more fit place for the harps of Israel to hang. Why? Because their joy was gone. In verse 4 it says, how shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? Now, sorrow does not keep us from singing. In fact, sorrow calls us to sing. Oftentimes there are, again, songs that David wrote while greatly depressed that ministered to him. We are among the redeemed, and we should sing the songs of the redeemed. Sad, glad, hearts full of praise, or hearts full of thanksgiving can all find peace and fuller expression in singing the Lord's songs. Ephesians tells us that we ought to sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. Plato, he wrote this particular phrase. In fact, I shouldn't have told you who it was that made this comment. But it talks about music. And there's both good music and bad music. It was interesting, like I said, you already know now, we're talking about centuries ago. But he says this new music is promoting the moral degeneracy of our adolescence. Can you imagine that? Talking about that in the first century? There are others through the years that have talked about, but now I have to say all that music that our parents, my parents anyway, thought was contributing to our degeneracy soon became elevator music. Now you hear it played in the stores everywhere, all the time. Noise is not music. You ever heard a little one grab a guitar or play instrument of something and just start making noise? Or up here on Sunday mornings when we've seen some of the little ones will come up and bang on the piano? That's not music. Music has harmony, has a melody, has a tempo. There's a design to it. Music is something that God has gifted us with, and it comes in many forms. Music can be misused, abused, and mismanaged. It can soothe, it can ease, it can calm the heart and the head, and it can minister to us like nothing else. And we should embrace this ministry in the best way that we can. We even need to be praying that God would send us a musical leader as well as a pastor to lead us in the coming years. May the Lord bless you.